questions, and beginning with a brief update on the BEP. So we've got numerous people who come on up.
From the way the stuff was laid out and what you just said, it's not clear. Do we want to do, are we doing kind of a discussion of the BEP stuff first? Okay.
There's
and
one
then
slide.
We'll go to the alternatives and
Yeah.
okay. I just.
We'll do the BEP with a little update there first, and
Yeah, I
then
think it might be a little more
go
than a
from
little.
there.
I guess it's what.
Well, there's only one slide.
Okay.
That's how long the conversation goes is up to us.
Yeah.
We got it, and there's copies around, so go ahead and get started.
Let me just reach across the table here. Okay, good evening. Thanks for joining our group today of experts around the field of intensive supports and support for students. Just some introductions. We have Jay Affeld, our Director of Physical, Mental, and Behavioral Supports, Quinn Craw, our Director of Behavior Education Plan, John Harper, Executive Director, Student Services, Armando Hernandez, who is our Assistant Director of Integrated Health and our Coordinator of Behavioral Health in Schools. I wrote that down. Ricardo.
Hi. Paris is on his way. He's coming back from a YWCA at Health training, so he'll be here shortly.
Yeah. So while we're talking tonight about intensive supports for students in our district, just wanted to remind the board that our work around cultural responsiveness, of course, should and will continue first and foremost as we begin these discussions tonight. Those are foundational practices in our district. We have made significant investments over the years related to our resources to support behavior education, intensive support to students in schools, and also central office support to schools. We've trained staff related to trauma and trauma-informed practices, mindfulness, CBITS, developmental designs. So all of those pieces, I just wanted to remind us, will continue, and our commitment to those continues. So what we're talking about is a robust approach that we're going to be presenting to you around students who have intensive support needs, and each of us will be taking a turn at sharing some thoughts about this. The conversation will go beyond just numbers of seats and articulate some other needs both now and in the future that we believe that, that we will need. We will also start the conversation. Jay's going to lead us off with some comments around the behavior education plan. We know that we wanted to spend a little bit more time around that, specifically related to dress code. So I'm going to have Jay kick us off with that conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. I think, as you all know, we've had such healthy discussions on the new behavior education plan over the course of the last 8 months, and we're truly thankful to all the students, staff, and families who were involved along the way, sharing their input, their ideas, and their suggestions. I also just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you to our Adhoc Committee for their ongoing commitment to this work and making sure that we get it right. We know that this isn't the primary conversation on deck for this evening, but we wanted to take at least just a few minutes to kind of update and discuss the BEP with the board. Also, just to highlight that our ad hoc committee will continue to meet into April, and we're meeting again next Monday, where we'll be finalizing our policies and moving on to our discussion on implementation. We've already formed our cross-functional teams that are working on those guidance documents that we'll be rolling out to schools in the fourth quarter. While nearly all areas of our plan seem really fairly settled, we're still hoping to make a few adjustments to our dress code. Just within the past week, we received some valuable feedback from 2 student advisory groups, including the Student Senate. There were 2 particular areas that they flagged for us. One was in the very initial paragraph where we highlight disruption or distraction as clothing that is not allowed or accessories that are not allowed. And students called out the fact that distraction kind of implies that we're judging each other in terms of what's appropriate, what catches my eye, what shouldn't catch my eye, which is back in sort of that gendered conversation or body shaming that we were so hoping to move away from. And so we will be removing the word distraction and discussing that with our ad hoc committee. The other feedback that Student Senate gave us, in particular focused on that very first bullet point, where we were indicating that clothing or accessories could not be worn that make it difficult to know who you are, implying that we need to be able to identify students. And again, getting back into issues of identity, we want students to be affirmed and representing whoever they are. And what we mean more specifically, connected back to our priority on safety, is being able to see a student's face, which is just simpler and easier to understand. And we don't want to allow things that would obscure a student's face. So those are our sort of like tweaks to the dress code that we'll be discussing with the ad hoc committee. And I'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you thought of possible religious exemptions on the facial coverings?
We do. So there is reference in here to sincerely held, religious affiliations that we wouldn't want anyone prevented from wearing something that was a part of their religious affiliation.
Because I know some hijabs can obscure part of the face.
Absolutely.
And I don't want it to be seen that offensive or distracting one another.
Yep.
TJ?
So this is up for a vote March 18th, is that correct? And this is the last time it'll be before the board committees before March 18th. I just on that. So I guess that with that in mind, first off, the climate question is still unsettled. Is that correct? The version I saw here didn't have the climate question metric is still unsettled, or is that? It's unsettled in my mind, but I'm not sure what it is on paper.
As far as safe and belonging?
No, as far as belonging, fairness, problem solving. I mean, there's 4 or 5 different things that were 3 or 4 that were suggested, and I don't recall. I mean, I think that's as far as I'm concerned, that's a live issue, and I guess. I don't know if this is the appropriate place in time to go further in that issue, or whether that should be done on the March 18th meeting.
Time to go into it, TJ. If everybody could reference the page number that's on.
It's page 5.
It's page 5 of the behavior plan itself. And this is specifically referencing goal number 1 and the related metrics that were under discussion at the last meeting. Yeah.
So the top of page 5 in any of those 3 policy drafts.
I think the team sent the board a grid that included all of the changes that they made since that meeting and some rationale behind it that included this section. So maybe you guys could say a few words about the change you did make.
So in January we had quite a bit of conversation with the board on just that, and the conversation hinged on belonging. And we were arguing that belonging was the umbrella under which so many of those other elements of school culture and climate would fit. And as we continued to kind of go through our notes, we kept coming back to, but belonging isn't exactly just it, and that safety matters as well. And perhaps that's something that you'll hear us say quite often, is that safety has to be our number 1 priority. And so we felt comfortable putting that back in, also knowing that there's a very clear metric for that's also included in the climate survey. We felt like that rounded out goal number 1 to include 2 sort of significant words that we feel sort of anchor a very healthy goal number 1. But happy to open it up for any other suggestions to how that could be reworded.
I guess I'm one of the first people who suggested safety, and since it's in the strategic plan survey already, and also some of the things that were said in response, there were 2 or 3 others that also kind of occurred to me. One of them is one that is the one that the perception of fairness, and something like 41% of our students only 41% of our students think that the implementation of the BEP is fair. Only 42% of our staff think that, and any plan where you have that level of confidence in the fairness is not going to work. And I think that we should be really cognizant and monitoring if people think things are fair, because to me that's just really kind of foundational. If you have a society where people don't think the laws are implemented fairly, then it's an invitation to disregard the laws. And I think that that's what's going on in our schools to some extent. And I think that, that within that majority of people who don't think it's fair, I think that there's probably some disagreements about why it's not fair. And I think that we should pay attention to those disagreements. And I think that those should be, a topic of conversation, because I just, and so that's number one. Number two is that.
Excuse me, TJ.
Yeah. No, I just want to hit the other suggestions for climate questions.
All right, well, I'll come back.
Okay, so that's one suggestion. The other one is, do students solve problems productively? Because that also seems to me that if we're being successful teaching social emotional learning, doing restorative justice, that students will solve problems productively. And that's a real good measure of what we want to be doing. A sense of belonging is certainly part of that, is part of it, but are we giving students the skills, and are we practicing, and are we giving them the opportunities to productively problem solve? Mm-hmm. And so those are the two that I would, to me, those two are just like really huge kind of places where our numbers aren't great. And if we focus our metrics, then maybe we will focus our efforts in improving those. Mm-hmm. So now I'm done with that.
Okay. To TJ's first point is we've seen that piece of data prior to this meeting, and we've had discussions about it before, so I'm assuming there's already been conversations as to what would cause that kind of disconnect. And when TJ asked about a conversation around that, I'd like to hear what you've learned as to the potential reasons why that only 41% think this is fair, and what could be the cause of that.
I'd love to chime in on that, Dean. And that's in part because we recently went over the climate survey questions with the research team in depth to kind of poke holes in it and determine which questions were giving us the best information and which ones weren't. I think one of the concerns about that particular question is kind of the definition and perception of fairness. It's we have a behavior plan that is equitable, right? Kids receive the response that they need, and right, that's the intent behind some of the shifts in the behavior plan. And while I think that we have some concerns, of course we want students to have a perception that things are fair, but fair doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same response, because every kid is different, every circumstance is different. So we weren't sure that that question was necessarily giving us the best possible information, TJ. And I think, I don't know if you guys want to add to that, but I think that is probably the primary reason. We don't want to put all of our eggs in that basket. I think this question about conflict is more interesting to me as a possible indicator. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
Well, adding to that,
yeah,
Jen, it wasn't just students that felt it was unfair, but staff as well.
Yeah.
So
mm-hmm.
that seems to be more problematic around, and I'm not so certain
and
if
parents.
there's clearly a definition of the word fair in the question. That could be something in there, but both parties pretty much landed on the same 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something we're not getting right here, and I'm not sure where it is.
Could I just have a point of clarity before we move on? So we're talking about goal 1 here?
We're talking about goal 1 and whether...
Goal 1, and the question on the floor was that it was unsettled. That's what
yeah, we're talking about which climate survey questions best get at a measurement of goal.
So basically they were saying it wasn't settled because I guess...
Yeah.
Okay, I guess that's a matter of opinion. When I left here the last meeting, I thought we were just settled on the goals. So that doesn't prevent a board member from opening it up, saying it can be improved. But I thought we had the goals settled.
Yeah, I don't think it's the goal that's in question here. It's more of the responses to why people so many people think it's unfair.
No, I think it's
I
we're
think
determining
that-
what metrics.
in my opinion, it's
Yeah.
not settled till the board votes on it, and that,
Right.
and, you know, so that's why I asked if this was the appropriate time. The other way to do it would be to offer
Yes.
an amendment at the meeting on March 18th, and,
You could do that too.
and so that's, you know, I asked if it was the appropriate time, but it's not settled till the board votes on it.
Yeah. There's also one more ad hoc meeting next Monday, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
There's one last ad hoc, so
There's
there's
one more ad hoc meeting, and that certainly
before
can be discussed
operations
there.
next week. So
Yeah.
there's an opportunity maybe to get a little bit more clarity on that issue.
Sure.
The survey itself is the issue, and I don't think it's the goal.
I would just want to,
Yeah.
I would just want to know what that, TJ, like, what are you wanting so that I can give it some thought before the meeting?
I guess I want to know, I want the climate survey metric to be aligned with a place where we need improvement and in a place that goes to the heart of the BEP. And I think that students solving problems productively goes to the heart of what our goals are for the BEP. And I think that the success of the BEP is related to the perceptions of fairness. And so those are why those two jump out at me as alternate metrics or additional metrics, maybe not alternate, but rather additional to belonging.
Okay.
And because the metrics we choose are where our efforts will be focused, inevitably. And I think that addressing why people don't think it's fair is something we should be focusing on. And I also think that our students solving problems productively is something we should be focused on. So, does that help?
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, regarding climate survey, when people are asking if they feel safe and if they feel a sense of belonging, it's like based exclusively on their own experiences and how they feel personally. The question of fairness and the questions of solving problems productively usually implies or usually forces them to think about like those around them, unless they themselves have been involved in conflict. And I think there's just perhaps a little bit less validity around fairness if it's, you know, based a little bit more on what I see going on around me. That's not to belittle that or say that that's not important. But I think perhaps solving problems productively is maybe a little bit more at the heart of like of the matter, and I think that could be, we could consider as a committee adding that to goal number one, that problems are solved productively.
Nikki?
I like the problem solved productively. To me, I like the fairness question because I think it's a better measure, because when you look at it, the group, instead of looking at it as how an individual only would look at it, you're only getting an individual's perspective on what narrow thing of what they feel on that. When you ask how something is fair, you're asking directly on, to me, I define fair as everyone gets what they need. Not everyone defines it in that manner.
Right.
I'm using an incredibly legal definition. Probably Black's dictionary type legal. But my issue is that when you say show fairness, you're saying I have trust. To me, that says I have trust in the process. I have trust in how it's carried out, and that it's carried out in a manner that people can rely on and expect what the result is. That doesn't mean they follow it lockstep always, but it means they understand what the result is. So I can see that as being that important, because it's hard to follow something you don't believe in.
That's a good point. Okay.
Ahmad?
Yeah, I just had a question about when we're getting into the actual code. For the response levels 1 and 2, one of the reactions to behavior is listed as support, and then later on it gets into administrative intervention. Can you talk about the difference and more about what that support would look like?
Ahmad, what page are you on, just so we can look at what you're looking
23.
at? Thank you. 23.
Yeah, I'll take that one, and Quinn may want to add something as well. So response level 2 is just sort of by definition something where there's been a call for support or where support staff are involved. Once we get to response level 3, that brings the possibility of an out-of-school suspension into question, and so we want our administrative staff more directly plugged into those situations, and that's why we refer to that as administrative intervention, just because as the consequences ramp up, we want our administrators more directly involved.
I would add it's more prevalent at the elementary behavior education plan, where when you get to a response level 3, students that are in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, there should be that conversation with the administrator, not always necessarily leading to in-school or even out-of-school discipline.
And then I have just a question on the dress code. I think that first bullet about making it difficult to know who you are needs to be that broad, obviously to give students a little bit of freedom in that regard. But I do think there's going to be it's going to be a little vague in certain cases. So who, I guess, gets jurisdiction over who's choosing what can be allowed and what can't be? Do students have a say in that? And how about staff?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering if you might share a little bit more about the Student Senate conversation, specifically around that. We had some questions, and certainly, you know, our mobile responders and our administrators are the ones that are making those fairly subjective decisions around, I'd like you to, you know, kind of undo your hood or tip your hat back up so I can see your face. But if I understand the conversation at Senate correctly, it was, you don't want one school to draw the line in a different place than the other school is drawing it. And so how will we work with our teams to sort of calibrate around that? And I think, you know, with a shift in the dress code, that means that we have more conversations when we pull our teams together to kind of discuss how things are going, what are you seeing, and what do we need to work through. I think it's fair to say that we, it was in our recommendations, we can always do a better job of calibrating across schools in terms of what's documented and you know, what's chosen for intervention. But
I would also add, Ahmad, that one way to go about kind of monitoring this through data is to work with school teams addressing specifically what the dress code violation was. That's not always clear in the documentation, so working with those that are responsible for putting in the infraction, so then we can look through the data and see how often is something like this even being addressed through a disciplinary measure.
Thank you.
First, in response to those issues raised, maybe we could have friendlier language around, you know, something like involvement by an administrator instead of administrative intervention, which sounds like it's this, you know, I mean, it has this ominous sound to it, right? But the reason I raised my hand was page 18 and 19, mostly page 19, on appeals processes around suspensions and rights of parents to be present and to be notified and things like that. There's a lot of references there to see this in this policy, see that in that policy. I think to be friendly to parents, if I wanted to know if my kid was in a suspension and I wanted to, or was being considered for a suspension, I wouldn't want to have to go 2 or 3 places to find out. I think it would be friendly to spell that out explicitly there. And the second thing around of suspension appeals is that I think that we'd have to change our suspension policy, but I'm hearing that they're very slow, like 6 weeks, and with kids in limbo for 4 to 6 weeks on a suspension appeal. And I think that maybe we should look at our policy and add some level of timeliness there, because that's not a good place to put kids and families. But the point for tonight's meeting is that if we can have the explicit, these are your rights in these situations, instead of referencing other documents on page 19, I think it is. Yeah. And then the final thing is something that's, again, not directly here, but something that is related to here, on in-school suspensions. I'm hearing that lunchtime detentions denying kids access to recess are being used. And I don't know if that's considered an in-school suspension or not, but our wellness policy explicitly says that you cannot deny access to recess. And so if we can have, you know, the next principal memo that goes out, letter, to remind them of that.
Yeah, that happened at Badger Rock when I was there.
Okay. It's happening at more than one school. And, you know, and that was kind of buried in the wellness policy, so maybe it wasn't communicated to the schools very well. but I think that that's something that you know, that is semi-related to what we're dealing with here. You know, there's a lot of really good things in this rewrite, and I guess that, you know, I feel like I've been nitpicking a little here and there. I think it's a lot more user-friendly for all the users. I think that the charts, most of them are really nice and good, and, you know, the flow charts and things like that. I think that we present our philosophy pretty well. So, you know, kudos and thank you for that work. And, you know, kind of on the other one is that I would like, with that in mind, I would like the special education guidance and the bullying guidance that's referenced at the end to come before the board at some point for, you know, for review and perhaps revision. So that's it. But again, you know, there's a lot of, you know, 30 pages is a lot. This is a lot more solid 30 pages than we had an 82 page or whatever it was. So thank you.
Thanks, TJ.
Yeah, it was 82.
Okay. Okay, Nikki, something else?
Just wanted to say thank you for especially changing the document that had expulsion first to expulsion at the end with the arrows, because my eyes went straight to the expulsion, and I think a lot of people's did. I appreciate that. 2, I'd like the special ed guidance. I agree with TJ on that. I want it to come before the board. I think that's really, really important. And 3, if I could answer Ahmed's question on dress codes, we could definitely look at the dress codes of that, but you still have what's called Tinker versus Des Moines rights. You don't give up your rights at the schoolhouse gate, which means that if the attire is deemed not to be a disruption to the educational process, then a student can challenge it.
Thanks, Nikki.
There's legal correction there, so I'm kind of nervous. Sorry.
Okay, this is, nitpicking is probably a lazy man's word of saying stop being so thorough. And I think being thorough is essential to this document, so I don't consider anything here being nitpicking at all. It's important that we get this right. And little tweaks is being thorough, not at all just trying to throw a little dig. Anybody else on this one? Remember, there'll be that one final ad hoc next Monday. Okay, so the full team is here.
I just thought of something.
Okay, quickly.
Just very quickly, have we decided on the number of social workers, for example? Are we going to increase it, or is it still going to be that one additional one?
We're about to get into that. I mean, you can answer the question for now.
Yeah, we'll get into that a
little
little bit. Your specific question about a feeder pattern social worker, our plan is still to pilot and then add 3 in the following year if that pilot goes well. But that'll come up a bit later tonight and then in more detail next Monday.
All right, thank you.
So also just to clarify, we are meeting ad hoc with our ad hoc committee next Monday, and we'll talk through some of these recommended changes and then finalize the document in the days that follow. But we're also planning to continue the ad hoc into April, where we'll be looking more specifically at kind of draft guidance documents and go from there. So just want you to know it's not the last. You still got us for at least another month or so.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So we got a full table. Everybody's here, including us, not just you. But we were a little short here too.
Yeah,
so we can. You want to begin this? Who wants to kick it off? So we'll
I'll transition us into this conversation. So, while many of you have recognized the new behavior education plan as the right work, including our focus in particular on foundational practices, interventions, and additional supports, we know that you still have a number of questions around increasing supports for students with intensive needs. So we're recreating for you tonight a conversation that we had at our January ad hoc committee meeting to discuss in more detail how these intensive supports are being expanded as we move forward. There's a quote on the screen that reminds us that throughout this conversation we have to hold tight to our values and the critical importance of doing everything we can to make sure that our students feel they belong. We must also recognize this work can still be done in schools to create even stronger school cultures, curriculum that is more rigorous and more relevant, healthy conditions that embrace every single student through development of the foundational practices that, as you know, are outlined in our new BEP. So what do we mean when we say that students have intensive needs? I think it's widely known that there are multiple points of view, and it's very complex work, and there's a very wide range of needs that exist across our pre-K students through age 21. As we've discussed, this is complex, but it's also integrated and it's also interdepartmental. And it's not just about seats, but as Lisa mentioned, it's about robust and powerful continuum of supports, which begin in schools and in some cases we know also extend beyond the setting and outside the school. So as a team, we'll kind of go department by department here to discuss specifically where we are and where we're going in each of these areas, including mental health supports, special education supports, and then development of innovative alternatives through the Office of Youth Re-Engagement. So I'll hand it over to Armando to talk about our mental health supports.
All right. Thank you, Jay. So I really want to start out by making the point that when we think about mental health supports, they really lie on top of the foundation that I think Lisa mentioned, and that it's certainly written into the behavioral education plan. A foundation that, as you all know, provides a solid climate, provides social emotional learning, and a number of key practices that hopefully all of our students are experiencing. Part of that foundation is also the key resource, which is our student services teams, which really includes our school psychologists, school social worker, school counselors, and nurses, who really not only they themselves deliver mental health support and promote social and emotional well-being, but they also partner in the delivery of these two particular interventions and programs that I will focus on today. We are doing quite a number of things in the arena in mental health, as you all know. Many of these initiatives have been going on for a number of years, but two that I think have been a focus for us and that we're really excited to grow is our Behavioral Health in Schools program and Bounceback. And as many of you are aware, the Behavioral Health in School program, what that program involves is based upon a partnership with a mental health agency, and it basically partners with a mental health clinician who is integrated inside the school to deliver mental health counseling to students who are identified. So what that means is that for those students that are identified as having intensive needs, they're able to experience and receive treatment by a clinician who is part of their school, who connects with their school team, and basically experiences a much warmer connection to those services. This service, as this clinician is integrated into the school, it basically enhances the school capacity to navigate mental health concerns in the building. We are now in our 4th year of active implementation of this program. We have grown from 3 programs in our pilot year to now 8 schools. And this program is data-driven as a high-intensity partnership. We are in our 4th year now, so you will be receiving an evaluation that will come to you in the weeks ahead. The second program is Bounceback, which begins with universal screening process at the 3rd grade level. So this intervention also moves our focus on delivering services at the elementary level. This year, we were very excited to see over 1,000 kids screened for trauma symptoms. And in those that were identified, we delivered this promising trauma-focused practice that, again, involves a partnership between the student services staff and the clinician from a partnering school. We are also exploring the mental health needs at all levels in our district, and that has really informed our planning moving forward. So where we're going in terms of behavioral health in schools is we're planning to expand from our current 8 schools to 12 schools, or adding 4 additional schools. We're looking to continue to secure our insurance reimbursement with our agencies. And as we reflect on our evaluation, we're going to modify our MOA and evaluation design as we move forward. In the for the Bounceback intervention, we are expanding from 20 schools this year to 24. And we're continuing to build the stability and sustainability on the program, primarily through building a local partnership to promote training. And then finally, we're also examining the mental health needs at the high school level. And one of the current initiatives that we are exploring is a high school focus, school-based health center that includes more of a comprehensive orientation to wellness, which includes integrated mental health support as part of that model. So those are just a couple of the initiatives that we're very excited to engage on.
Okay, before you go on, the last point is important to understand that the school-based health center, we know there are some of those already existing in other districts, which we may think that we're behind on that. So that, I think, is an excellent idea, particularly understood that it's a comprehensive wellness center, so there won't be any stigma attached that it's only for people that are having mental health issues. It's a comprehensive across the board, and should be really promoted as such, so that any hint of a stigma will be eliminated. Nikki?
Yeah. That was exactly what I was going to say, was how do we avoid the stigma issue, because as I know many people who are like, no, I don't want my child to live. No, I don't want my child at age 10, 11, 12 with that, and everyone knows it. And there's a lot of stigma around it, and I don't want kids not to get tested because people are afraid of what label will go with them.
Correct.
If you don't mind, we'll kind of, as we go through them, we'll pause here for a minute and ask questions around this, and then at the end we can put them together.
I wanted to address the stigma issue. Would that be all right? I just want to make sure.
Oh,
yeah. So I definitely agree, and I think that by definition, anything that is integrated into the school, I think that's one of the powerful arguments for integrated services, both on the mental health and the health side, that they're connected to their school, their community, the folks that they know. And you're right, for us, parental concern and having family engagement as one of the drivers at each one of those initiatives is critically important.
Okay. Ahmad, TJ, Kate.
I think TJ was first, if you want to
go ahead. We'll go down the line here.
I think the last bullet point on the last slide, the exploring of the mental health needs, is huge. So I was just curious, what have you found that, the differences in the needs are between different, elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools? Have you explored any of the causes, also just in general?
Great question. So we're definitely in the initial levels of identifying those. One of the sources that we have are more robust interventions, which includes CBITS, our cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, which is delivered in all of our middle schools. We had found that we fill almost basically historically every single middle school has delivered a group. We have found some schools that have delivered more than one group. So we know that trauma is a definite concern. Also at the third grade level, as we've implemented Bounceback as well, we have found that in our current, we have 20 schools where those groups are being delivered. And again, as we do that universal screening, many students are identified to be included in the group, and there's many others that are identified for alternative supports. So that universal screening, it's really important. There has also been other sources of feedback, as we know, through the behavioral education plan process, where we know that what many of the administrators and principals and community is saying that the mental health needs are out there. And I think that you raise up an important next step, which is us not only to identify what are the concerns, but beginning to explain what are the root causes. Trauma is an interesting one. When we identify trauma, it comes along with a bit of a root cause. We know that it was a distressful event that the student experienced, and we know that there's many other mental health concerns, whether it's anxiety, depression, etc., that we definitely want to continue that conversation. I think that we can we have nice methods of screening, and we also need to continue following that up as well.
Yeah, kind of two areas. One of which is following up on universal screening. We're doing universal screening in what grades now? And then the kind of the follow-up question is, have we considered doing it in more grades?
Yeah.
So what grades are we doing now? We're doing 3rd, 5th, and 10th, or something like that?
So technically, the schools that participate in Bounceback, so it's 3rd grade, so we can go out of those 20 schools. We're doing universal screening then. All of 6th grade schools provide screening for CBITS, and that screening is pretty broad, and not only it addresses depressive symptoms, but also responses to stress and trauma. And then at the 10th grade level, we're doing depression screening at the comprehensive high schools, or at the high school level, sorry. And it's definitely part of our plan to increase that screening level. From my perspective, I would love to see screening at the 5th grade level and then the 8th grade level to really get that touch point before the transition. And I know, as you know, the tension with screening always is you want to screen and have something to offer. So we want to be measured in screening while we have the resources to be able to provide needed supports.
I'd add 9, 10, and 11. I mean, 9 and 11 and maybe 12 there
Okay.
also. And I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's, I mean, these are key years, and just national data, we know that
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, suicidal
Hmm.
things are all very prominent there. And I guess that, and then I want to add one more piece on screening is also that with our kind of very spotty screening, our students who move from other districts who may never be screened in our district and may never become, you know, these things may be ignored. So I'm just going to point that out. The other question is kind of a transitional question, which is what kind of mental and behavioral health services are offered integrated with the special education alternatives that we're going to discuss next? And how does that work? And I guess this is it is a transitional question, but I know that a lot of those, I mean, you know, in terms of, you know, we have our partnerships with Bounceback and behavioral health in schools, and I guess that do those have access to those partnerships, or are they doing it all on site, or just kind of we can?
Yeah, and I think that John will address that as he describes his program. So I don't know if we want to, I don't know if there's other questions.
Kate's got another question,
okay.
So we can
address that and then come back.
And Gloria, then we got a bunch of questions, so
Okay.
we'll get to that one combined with the special ed, and I think they have some information already prepared on that, so we'll wait till then. Go ahead, Kate.
So I think some of the questions today that are kind of focusing on age levels, when I look at this, I see elementary, that we have interventions for elementary for mental health supports with clinicians. And can you talk a little bit about what we do or don't have for middle school and high school?
Yeah. So 3 initiatives that I'll highlight. So one of them is an individual intervention. It's called SBIRT, which is basically a brief intervention based on motivational interviewing, which is a very supportive, collaborative, brief intervention, and that's a secondary focus intervention. And we've been doing that SBIRT training around that for a number of years. This year, we're focusing on 6 particular secondary schools that want to really provide a strong focus on implementation. I think it's also important as we look at the range of interventions to also provide a combination between group interventions and individual as well. So I think that's one that I think we will continue to be focusing on. Also, we've had a couple of other secondary focus tier 2 or more selective group interventions. One of them is called DBT Steps A, which is social emotional intervention based on cognitive behavioral principles, essentially creating skills to help kids manage their emotions, students manage their emotions, and identify emotion and problem solve effectively. And then the final one, it's called SET, which stands for Skills for Students Exposed to Trauma. And this one is a CBITS type intervention that it's also going to be delivered at the high school level. We just had a training on it. We had 6 schools participate. The uniqueness of that intervention is that it can be delivered by our student services staff themselves. Doesn't require licensed mental health professional.
So I was going to ask 2 follow-on questions, one of which is what are the resources used? So I'm hearing high school, elementary, maybe not as much middle.
So all those are at both.
Both. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So the SBIRT and the SET are at both middle and high school.
And
so
Armando, just real quick on
Yeah.
BHS. I know it was at Senate. Are there other middle schools?
Yeah.
that are
So
doing BHS?
yeah. So
Just
it's
wanna make
Senate
sure.
and Blackhawk right now. So there's 2 middle schools.
Okay.
Thanks.
Send us copies of this?
I'm sorry.
Can you send us copies?
Descriptions. Absolutely happy to do it.
So who in the schools is kind of delivering those interventions, and then just can you rough back of the envelope, how many kids are we touching?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So in the school, generally across all those interventions, it's not exclusively, but primarily is school psychologists and school social workers who are delivering those interventions. And some of them at the middle school level, also school counselors. Some school counselors are involved. And in SBIRT, for example, we've had some nurses that also have been trained and have utilized those interventions. And as you know, as I mentioned, each one of them looks a little bit differently. Sometimes they partner with a mental health clinician, but usually those are the roles that are involved. There's a lot of variability in terms of, if we look at behavioral health in schools, the typical caseload for those students are around 20 students. So if we're looking at so roughly about 150 or so students that will be touched by that. For the Bounceback program, it's about 20 schools. It's about 4 to 5 students per group. And then that would be similar to the other programs, and a lot of variability in terms of the implementation data.
So on SBIRT, DDP Step A, SET, the same number, like six schools, you said?
So I would say that on average, that's probably, yes. So around all those schools, we have between 5 and 6 schools participating in those programs. And then the level of implementation varies. I also would be happy to give you a little bit more specific numbers because it's sort of a graphic.
I guess I'm just trying to calibrate how much support we're offering to kids past 5th grade, right? So it's about half our district is older than 5th grade.
Yeah.
I don't know. You guys, TJ, you probably know the number off the top of your head.
Correct.
15,000 students.
Yeah.
Are we talking about having supports available for 150-ish?
So, I mean, it's hard for me to come up with a specific number. The other variable, for example, if you look at CBITS, which is happening at the middle school level, so at that we have universal screening. So that is essentially is having a touch on all those students, and then we are essentially evaluating all the students and then identifying which ones are needed. So that's the power of a robust program. Generally speaking, we have most schools delivering at least 1 group, with some delivering 2, and those groups also range in the number of 4 to 6. The other. So I would have to. I hesitate to give a specific number. What I do want to say is that there's and I know that you probably know this, that there's a bit of a domino effect too, as we, for example, have students trained in these interventions. They develop better trauma-sensitive skills. They develop better skills around interviewing students and interviewing. So I always like to think that they're involved, and also in the behavioral health in schools, it's a partnership that they're creating with an expert in the field, so that there's also a spread of them consulting with that clinician and then being able to further support students.
So maybe just the last question then for me is kind of flipping that. If we were to say we've got a list of priority actions at the end here and kind of some investment areas, if we were to do more, particularly for middle school, high school in this area, what would it be? what's the kind of biggest first move that we could do that would impact kids in secondary?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So my mind goes through at least three different places. I mean, one it's certainly, as I mentioned earlier, we also have to look at the universal foundation. So I'm always keeping an eye into what are we doing at the universal level through social emotional curriculum, and to strengthen that basic. So we know that while we want to have interventions on the top at the tier 2 and tier 3 level, that we need to provide those basic skills that are going to be critical. So I'm always attending to what are those connections between those two. I'm also attending to the ability of our own student services team to have the time and space to deliver these interventions. And that's been part of our lean into not only doing training, but also supporting with the implementation day in and day out. So how does the teaming look like? How does those decision-making processes look like? So that's an important, that's a little bit abstract, but it's part of our work. More specifically, I think right now in the two directions that we're taking, behavioral health in schools at the middle school level, I think that is, I think as we increase into more middle schools, I think that will have an impact. The school-based health center, we're looking at an integrated model that again is going to have that integrated mental health component to it. One of the innovative models out there is one that provides brief intervention that has the opportunity to really serve a lot of more different students versus a more intensive model. So I think that school-based health center model, I think also has the impact to, as a comprehensive center, to have a broad impact into the culture of the school, but also deliver an important service.
But we've got nothing in the budget for that. So does that mean this is a planning year, or does that mean this is we're doing it all with what we have? What's the? So it's definitely a planning year that we are, and we have already started. So we have been consulting with the School-Based Health Alliance, which basically supports districts across the country to develop this model. This model, the model that they have found to be really helpful is partnering with a local health agency to essentially deliver that and co-create that together. So we really are moving, and our next step is to certainly continue pursuing that partnership and begin looking at pilot schools where would that make sense. Thank you.
Just to remind everybody, the bump from 8 to 12 and 20 to 24 starts next year. 1920, so there is later on there's some budget information. Gloria, you were next.
So just to go off what Kate was asking, as we continue to increase mental health supports, what is just your perspective on the capacity that we have even in the community, not even with the school, the capacity of investing in mental health? And what does that look like? And then also, just long term, how do we sustain this effort and moving forward? Just wanted to get your perspective on those two things. And then I think I do have another additional question.
Yeah, and I know we had touched that on the Adhoc Committee, and after having that preliminary conversation, that question kept echoing in my mind, and I had reached out to some colleagues around it in the community, because I tend to be optimistic, and my instinct is, we have a lot of resources, we need to be more innovative, we need to just use our time better. And when I ask candidly, some of my colleagues, they say no. I mean, when you think about mental health in our community, we don't have enough resources allocated to what the need is. When we look at the community-wide level, whether it's level of trauma, whether it is toxic stress, we are just needing a lot more resources at all levels. And in my previous experience in the healthcare field, I have noticed how what used to be the typical model of providing every other week support or weekly support now is typically, if you want to see a therapist, you'll have to see somebody every 3 to 4 weeks. That's just sort of normative treatment. And I think that speaks to the level of need that is out there. So I think that for me, what I resonate with these programs, particularly integrated models, and both models that are about building partnership, bringing resources in, but also building the capacity of our own staff. I think that we need to do both, because I think we recognize that there is a lot of need out there, and I think both things are true. So that was maybe going around in terms of the need. The second part of it is around sustainability. I think that maintaining staff wellness at the center, I think it's really important as we're asking our own staff to support the social emotional well-being of our students. I think they themselves need to be in a place where they can do that. One of the other things that I meant to mention earlier was part of the earlier triangle was that one of the initiatives, and I think Lisa alluded to it, is our work around trauma-sensitive schools. One of the important piece of it is that it maintains staff wellness at the center. So again, that initiative, which is a school-wide initiative, is another entry point to it. And I think we're doing some pretty exciting things. I think we're cutting edge in a number of things when it comes to how we're delivering mental health services.
Great, thank you. And then just one more question. So in our ad hoc committee, we keep, something that kept coming back was really providing the support for those students who need intensive support. I'm just curious, through evaluation, what is working with those, small percentage of students who need intensive needs? Is there one thing that we can, or one area of focus that we can continue to invest in, that we know through evaluation is working?
Great question. Well, I think the evaluation around the behavioral health in school model, I think, will be very interesting to examine. One of our learnings has been that there is challenges not only around measurement and knowing exactly what works, but when we're trying to serve essentially a population that is identified as intensive, we unfortunately know that there's no easy solutions. Mm-hmm. So even though we're providing them with, in a way, I think, the best service out there, we still experience a lot of struggles in moving that outcomes, because we know that why kids struggle, it's multifactorial, right? There's a lot of reasons, and it's part of it is internal and part of it is external, and it's part of their larger context. One of the places that I know I lean into, and I think why we have had a focus around identifying trauma, is that we know in the example of CBITS, for example, that is an evidence-based practice, that we know that in large urban districts, this has worked, it has an impact, it helped kids feel better. And I think there's something in particular about trauma that, we can identify when they've had an experience, but that we know what works to alleviate that suffering. And also, as we know, trauma, it's an incredibly culturally responsive approach, right? As we are identifying something externally that happened to a student. So I think that there's also an important connection there. So I would definitely say that services that can improve skills, which again, trauma-focused interventions do. And I think also, for me at least, interventions that also build the capacity of the larger team to navigate mental health services better is the focus that we should have.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all for your work, and it's good to hear more in depth what this means when we talk about mental health supports for our students. Do we have any, are there any elementary schools that have both the Bounceback and the behavioral health in schools?
Yes.
Which would those be?
Yeah, so right now that is Leopold and Glendale and Schenck. Okay.
Okay. And I'm interested because I'm sort of trying to get at a little bit the same issue as Kate and as Gloria, just looking at what this looks like. And I know it's still early in terms of the assessment. I'll be looking, I'm looking forward to that. But as we plan as a district the resources that will be needed. I'm very interested in what our experience has showed us in those schools where there is, where we have both. Because if we're looking at investing more and expanding these programs, I would imagine the schools that have both are pretty good indicators, at least, of some initial findings.
Yeah.
Without going into the whole assessment, but I'd be interested in what we're seeing.
Yeah, I am too, and I think that we are also improving our capacity and procedures around capturing these interventions, so we can progress monitoring the impact that they're having, and that's just a better access to the data, so we know what's working and what impact is having.
Well, I look forward to that. Another question that's different than the assessment, but certainly all around the capacity planning as well, is how this is structured in those schools. Do you feel that it meets the needs, at least from the number of students who are being served? Is that the scale that we're at sufficient?
I think it's variable. So I think some schools I think identify that if we think of, for example, behavioral health in schools, again, one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but this is a 0.5, so it's 20 hours. They identify that that's good enough, and we're not surprised that, for example, a school like Senate, a middle school with a lot of students, that they could certainly benefit from more. We have been internally creating models by which schools can potentially explore increased allocation around that. I think right now our model has been to try to spread that into more schools versus increase within school. But as I look at us having better metrics of what the actual school need, I think we'll have to remodel that, continue to attend to that, and be flexible. I certainly would foresee, as I envision what's the 5-year or plus-year plan of BHS, that at some point we'll definitely be looking at that within school allocation and developing some flexibility around that.
Are there models around having, I don't want to say, well, group, or, so I imagine, are these both one-on-one? So are there because you're very limited as to the scale there versus the needs, and I would imagine there's a huge variability in the needs, the intensity of the needs too. Are there other models that look at multiple children being served?
Yeah, so we have explored that model. I think from my perspective, I'm right there with you in terms of wanting to see the mental health clinician both deliver the modality of individual and groups. The biggest challenges that we found was around their time allocation. That running a group and bringing it together took an extra level of investment. The schools are able to quite well identify a full caseload that needs services at the individual level. And I think one of our many growing edges is how are we progress monitoring even the delivery of service through the year, so that exploring whether or not they can deliver it differently. In one example, we do have a school where the clinician that is serving the school is also the Bounceback clinician. So that's also a very integrated model. They're also being contracted in addition to their time. So I think that's ideal when you have the same person who's connected to the school is able to deliver both. But I agree. I think that will be another way of expanding the capacity in a way that can serve more students.
Well, and this will just be my final comment. It brings to mind previous programs we've had, not around mental health supports, but say around reading intervention, where we take a program that shows promise, then we try to meet more and more students' needs because there is greater need. But then somehow the fidelity to the program suffers when we try to do things. And so I just want to, I'm certainly, the more efficiently we can do it, the more students we can do, but I'd certainly love to be using the assessment, but also iterating on the development on what we've learned to try to understand what models are really being effective and what does fidelity to that look like, and have it be a basis that informs how we do expand, so we just don't keep expanding without seeing the impacts and creating those types of models we believe best serve our students.
Yeah, agreed. And the other piece quickly that I would add, that we're also leaning in as well into our own internal student services staff, who often can deliver those groups and provide added supports. So so I think that's another one of the benefits of models that are integrated, that they're able to look at all of the resources.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, didn't see you. Dean. My question actually, I understand why you do the individual model. My question is, when you do the screenings, do you do them all at the same time, or kids singled out? Because what I've seen on groups is kids tend to know, oh, that's what this group meets, and that's because this is wrong with that. I've heard that in schools for years. I've seen that in schools for years. How do we avoid that? Do we do the screenings on one day? Do we do pullouts? How exactly do we do it without further traumatizing or stigmatizing?
Yeah. So for the CBITS model, again, which is in middle school, where we do universal screening, that is all done at the same time. And there is added measures to maintain sort of being mindful of spacing so that students aren't able to see each other's answers. But again, that's part of the benefits of having something that is universal across. Many times also at the 10th grade level for depression screening, that's integrated into their health education classes. So there's also a very positive frame around, we're talking about suicide prevention, and then we're going to do this screening to get some feedback. I will say that at the 3rd grade level, I should have said this earlier, the universal screener is actually a teacher nomination. So at the 3rd grade, we're not asking them right off the bat of what is your perception. So we rely on the teachers to provide us with an initial picture of their social and emotional functioning, and then identify students, get parental consent, and then going from there with the interviewing.
Sure.
Before we potentially head into the next topic, Armando, I just want to punctuate that what you put on paper here is what you think is the best and most aggressive investment that we can make for this upcoming year, which I know I can sense the desire to want to do more. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about CBITS and the potential for using it at the high school level. Because as a United Way board member and someone who's been in the room as we've discussed the effectiveness of CBITS in that venue, it's always been really inspiring to me to see the high level of effectiveness. And I know it's come up in the past, the potential to expand to the high school level. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so CBITS is definitely an intervention that it's used at the high school level. Many of our neighboring districts are using it at that level as well. It's been shown to be effective. Part of our response is SET, which is the almost less intensity intervention that utilizes our own student services staff. Not that those two could not be complementary. Again, CBITS is the more robust intervention, but I think that's certainly something to be explored. And as we think about models that and a need for at the high school level, I think that's definitely worth exploring.
I mean, if there's a gap in what we have in play right now, what we're expanding, it seems to me that the high school level is the place where we're missing some kind of intervention, which is why the clinic idea is so appealing, I think, to many of us. There's a lot of potential there. But I just wonder if maybe pushing harder and faster on CBITS at the high school level as an interim step might be something we could do in addition to what's already on the table.
Cool.
Okay.
John, you're up, buddy.
All right. Okay, regarding supporting the needs of students with disabilities, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the significant investment we're making in special education teachers, with the addition of 11.5 new staff in that area, and in student services as well. I know this came up earlier. Are we still doing the addition of social worker and psychologists? Yes, we have. We have already populated the budget books with an increase of 2.5 social workers and 3.7 additional school psychologists. So it's our belief that adequately resourcing schools forms the basis of meeting the unique needs of our students with disabilities within their neighborhood schools. And so while our preference is to provide high quality special education services in their home school, there are circumstances and situations where a small number of students need something different. And what you see on your screen or up on the board are those very programs. The programs in blue, and maybe a little bit hard to see that, those are exclusively for students with disabilities. Those in green are integrated, meaning they're students with and without disabilities. Specifically, Replay and Restore are integrated. Each is actually a link, so if you're accessing this via your computer, you can link into that and get a program description of each of these programs. And I would say those programs that I have listed there, LEAP, the STEPS program, NEON, School-Based Alternatives, Foundation Central, those are all exclusively for students with disabilities, and they're much less of an alternative school, and they're more an aspect of our continuum of services. We actually refer to those internally as more of our intensive intervention programs. I did want to loop back to TJ's question earlier about what about students in off-site programs. So LEAP is actually a program within a school, same with school-based alternative. But there are programs like STEPS, either primary STEPS or Next STEPS, which is located, the program location is at Olin Avenue. So this is actually a really burgeoning and positive partnership with Family Services, which actually shares the parking lot with our program. So it's a partnership between our staff and Family Services to provide mental health services for our students in either individual or group settings. And so yes, those students, while they wouldn't necessarily be participating in Bounceback, they're participating in something much more intensive and significant and really centered on their individual needs. Did that address your? Okay.
And yes, thank you.
Okay. I should also point out that Restore, our program for students in expulsion abeyance, they're also recipients at times of some of our mental health services from Family Services. Next, I'm going to switch gears to where we're going. Oh, yeah.
On this part?
Yeah.
Okay.
My question is, and I may have asked it in the past, a student may initially be placed there for a short period of time, correct?
That's correct.
And is there a specific plan to transition them back? Because a lot of times you hear they get in and then you never hear anything about them. Do we have a plan, formal transition plan to send them back to their home school?
Yes, that's an excellent foreshadowing of what we're talking next. So that's actually the last bullet point, but I can take this in reverse order. And I would say that one of the goals that we have is always to provide the necessary supports, services for students so that they are, once they reach their consistent state of regulation, they're returning back to their neighborhood school with a transition plan associated with that. That's one of those things that we can always do better. I think what we're learning is increasing the communication between the program location and the home school about these are the supports, the services that really work for the student. We've experimented a little bit with having our staff from the intensive interventions accompany the student to shadow and to teach, so to speak, or to model appropriate strategies and practices, and then gradually release and then return back to the intensive intervention program. So in terms of where we're going here, our goal is to continue expanding our therapeutic day options with a focus on moving forward for students at the high school level. To Kate's point earlier, we are in the initial planning phases of how would we implement a small program, intensive mental health services for students with disabilities. But a very tangible next step is we are going to be adding another staff person to our primary steps. So we're bolstering the capacity in the elementary and planning for high school. I think it was maybe Gloria asked earlier about the capacity of within the city, and I would say that we're somewhat linked to our expansion is premised on how quickly our collaborating partners are also able to expand. So if that makes sense, like we would love to hit the accelerator on this faster. However, it's somewhat contingent upon how quickly our partnership with, say, Family Services can also accelerate their staffing availability. So we're working through that right now, and we think that we are on a plan for as quickly as we can sustain high quality services for our students. And I would say too that in the last 6 years we actually have dramatically increased the capacity of our offsite and our intensive intervention programs for elementary age students, nearly tripling the amount. One of the things that we're again also focusing on is improving the quality of programming and services that take place in our intensive intervention programs through alignment of curricular resources and strategies, through culturally responsive practices, through providing increased levels of student services supports with that nursing, psychologist, social worker on site to really teach students the social emotional skills that they need to be successful in that program, and then as they return to their neighborhood school. So I'll pause there, take a breath, and then take questions.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yes.
What are the current measures of progress you're using to evaluate the success of any of these programs that we have?
Yeah, that's actually a seemingly very innocuous, easy question to ask, and it's actually much more difficult to address. So yes, we have attendance, we have behavior, we have hard test score data on how a student is progressing academically. We're exploring longer term impacts. If you're in an intervention program, what is the longer term? Does it actually have an impact on graduation rates? Does it have an impact on success in, say, high school in terms of credit attainment? Are you on a trajectory for 4-year graduation or such? So yes, those are the measures that we're using internally. There's some of the very easy ones to measure, when I began. The harder ones are developing systems and practices that are able to track students longer term. I think the point was made earlier about how do students stay there long term, or is this intermittent? So many of our students are in our program locations for a year or less. So it's hard to really tease out, can this be traced long term to the positive outcomes or not? So we are working actually right now with our research and program evaluation to develop more sophisticated ways of evaluating the efficacy of our programs.
And just a follow-up to that, how would we, without knowing those long-term outcomes, go about expanding programs to more schools and to reach more kids? Is that something that we're seeing that's going to happen in the near future, or is that going to come after the evaluation? Yeah, so
there's a number of things that I think develop, kind of striking that right balance of need and availability. There's one metric that we have to answer that question is sort of the supply demand. We have a process for students referred for for our intensive support team. It's where our intensive support team responds to schools, engages in problem solving, engages in observations, testing theories on how to provide an intervention tied to the students' behavioral needs. And if that is in a place where the student may not be responding positively, there's a consideration for, are one of our more intensive intervention programs appropriate? And so we look at, is there a wait list that gives you a sense for what is the need compared to your supply and demand, so to speak? And there frequently is a wait list, but it's actually pretty small at this point. So if we're feeling like we're at the right point in terms of our supply and demand. Yeah.
Okay, Kate, Nikki, then Gloria.
Couple of questions. I mean, maybe on the supply and demand question, maybe more on the demand side. I mean, so how many students in our district are is a student with a disability? Is like 13-ish%? Or
it's a little more than 13%. It's about 14.7. So it translates
So
to about
15%.
3,900.
And how many of those students would benefit from stronger kind of interventions of the nature of what we're talking about here?
Well, are you speaking to how many would benefit from being off-site, or what is what do you mean exactly by
I mean,
that?
I guess an intervention that would require something past the kind of CC teacher, SEA, the staffing model that we have already in place in schools. So something more differentiated. These all offer kind of different differentiations, so in school or out of school, but something.
Yeah, I guess the way
something
I
that
would
requires more resources, different resources, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I would quantify that by reviewing IEPs. In other words, there are related services that are associated with a student's individualized program. So that's the nature of the conversation that takes place at an IEP meeting. There's the academic, behavioral, and then if there are additional supports and services that are needed from, say, a school psychologist, a social worker, and so forth, that would be a vital component within the IEP.
I guess I'm trying to get at, so you just said 3,900 kids, 4,000 kids, and we've got supports for about 150 that we're talking about right now. So I'm trying to get at, you know, is it 5% of the 4,000? Is it 10? Like what's the gap between where we are currently meeting needs and where we would want to be meeting needs?
Well, I think that's a hard question to really address, because actually there's multiple services within the school that we feel are appropriate. There's, for example, we were just speaking to Bounceback, we're speaking to CBITS, we're speaking to the depression screener, speaking to all the other programs which are available to students with disabilities, behavioral health in schools, which are integrated within the school.
My next question about how these things are interacting.
Yeah, they definitely link together. One isn't exclusively for students without or with disabilities. I mean, these are programs that are available to all.
Well, but they're not available for all if there aren't availability, right? So we're talking about adding 8 seats, are where we are to where we're going next year for this level of intervention within special education is an initial planning for high school students starting with 8 to 10, right? So 8 to 10 high school students for the whole district is not available for all, just because I don't hear anyone saying we only need 8 to 10 seats, right? So I'm trying to get at what's the gap, and are we doing enough to close the gap in terms of services or interventions?
I think I better understand your question.
There's no perfect answer on numbers. Like, I'm not looking for a perfect number. I'm just looking for, you know.
I think I would say it's abundantly clear that 8 to 10 is not like the sweet spot for meeting our supply and demand. It's much higher than that. How much? It's hard to really pinpoint a precise number, but I would say this is a decent starting point. It's the addition of our mental health services that will be targeting for the integrated health clinics within schools. It's the combination of all of those that will, in our mind, meet the demand going forward.
Okay. I mean, I think we'll probably come back to this. Like, my take on this whole presentation is really, particularly for secondary, just a need to do more faster. And I appreciate the supply and demand challenges. And I would like to continue to see us push ourselves to do more faster, right? So a planning year, an initial start at 8 kids, like, what else can we do? If we need more resources, then ask us and make us say no, right? But at least ask, at least put on the table what we need, and then we can come back to what we can do. But I feel like you guys are coming to us with already a scaled back kind of, here's what we think is viable. And it's probably because you know a hell of a lot more than us about what's available in the community in terms of resources, but at least put on the table what we think we need to meet our kids' needs, and then let us scale it back based on budget, et cetera. So that would be my ask. second question was, John, exactly what you just brought up, which is how are the special education resources working in collaboration and partnership with everybody else at the table, basically?
Yeah, I mean, as I just stated, like the behavioral health in schools, CBIS, these are all programs that are available to everyone at that school location. Behavioral health in schools, I would venture that it's probably 40% students with disabilities or 30% in terms of the students served through that program. So they're definitely dovetail with each other. One is supporting the other program.
Can you guys speak to it a little bit too? Just.
Well, I mean, so one point of collaboration, I think, are the teaming structures that schools have. So SSIT, for example, which is the team that comes together to problem solve. That often is the touch points where that individual problem solving is happening, and then the team is deciding what the supports do they need. In some schools, that looks more like an MTSS team, so that we're having both the academic support and the social emotional supports also come together. They're looking at data and really looking across the tiers. What is that it's needing, and I think that our teams are basically, they're the ones that are connecting all those different levels of support and attending to the gaps and making those programs happen.
John, can I try to ask Kate's question again? Mm-hmm. If that's all right. These programs, by and large, are for students with disabilities, and so they would only emerge if the request for a seat would only emerge if an IEP team felt like that was the least restrictive environment for this particular student, right? The environment in which they should best receive their services.
Correct.
So we don't want to add seats just for the sake of adding seats. We want to do it based on demand, and demand comes from the IEP team.
Correct.
So tell us again, like, do you feel like there are IEP teams that are requesting placement in programs that are on this list, or programs maybe that don't exist that we wish were on this list? That, right, you mentioned the waiting list not being long. Can you just expand on that? Because that's where the need lies, right? We don't want to expand seats for the sake of expanding them, only if it is appropriate for real kids based on close analysis.
You know, we begin the year with zero wait lists, and as you progress through the year, programs fill up. And as we progress towards the end of the year, the fourth quarter, we tend to see a wait list of anywhere between, like, it could be zero, but it's generally 1 to maybe 2 to 3 students at the most. If there is a place where we are completely devoid of having a program with our programming needs, with what currently exists, it's at high school, a therapeutic option for high school. Each of the high schools have created their own almost like mini intensive intervention or alternative program. You maybe heard the acronym SAIL, West High School, East High School. They take some of their special education allocation. They have a program off-site. There are students with either in those programs or within the high schools that would immensely benefit from having a more therapeutic day option for their educational experience. So that's why this is an initial start that I expect longer term will grow to a much more significant point. So I would say yes, there's most of the year there's not a wait list. Going back to your original question, towards the end of the year, there generally speaking is a wait list. Towards that point, then we're beginning to transition students back into their neighborhood school, and then the process begins anew.
But even when there's 1 or 2 students on a wait list, that can be really hard on a kid, on a school. So what I hear you guys is pushing for is, even if it's a little bit more.
I mean, some of the question comes from some of the dialogue that we've had in the ad hoc from teachers and schools articulating more the latter, that there is no option for X at Y level. So there's no option for this student with this need in middle school or in high school or, you know, so like.
How do we address the gaps faster?
And that's just not good enough, right? And I think there are many of us on the board right now that feel the need to push harder, do more to address kids who we can be supporting better.
Yep.
And so I'm trying to get underneath where are those gaps, and there are no gaps it doesn't feel like a true answer to me.
Yeah, and you're hearing that.
I appreciate that we may not be talking about 500 students, although we may, and Paris may talk about that. But we've heard enough stories of there is no option for this kid. So help us figure out at what level for which kids, and then let's do something about it. So, okay.
Okay, Nikki, Gloria, then TJ.
Just a couple questions. One, on the least restrictive environment, how do we, does the IP team, I know, decides the least restrictive environment? Is there any way that we could start moving these in-house, in our own buildings, closer? Because I think the farther away, this is more a comment than a question, I think the further away they are, the less likely that people can see what's going on, A, in transparency, but B, in getting their needs met. I think that would be incredibly helpful.
Well, it's a good, yeah.
And I have two questions. I believe they're related. In my tangential mind they are, so could you please humor? And that is, has the number of students receiving special education increased in the past few years?
It has.
Yep.
Like
The prevalence rate.
significantly?
No, not significantly. It's gone up like several tenths of a percentage point.
And has that stayed the same among low income and races? Is there a way to know that?
So a disaggregation by race and income level?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you just made a board or
I think I
a
did,
data
but I don't
request,
remember
and
right now.
that is actually being
Perfect. Thank
acted
you.
upon.
I've
So
been, my kind of flooded Friday, so what I've asked,
yep, it's
please
in
relay
process. Nope.
because I've been a little scared.
No
Yep.
problem.
No, that should be coming to you shortly.
And I really appreciate it.
And it was for the last 5 years is what your question
the
was.
last 5 years, because, I mean, I'm curious to know, to see where we can, it's the same thing, Kate and I have pretty much the same idea, where can we help and where the gaps are, because I'm hearing it from the teachers too.
Okay.
So my question is somewhat on the data, but particularly focused on those who are identified as EBD, the emotional behavior. And I know I've asked this question over and over again, and I'm just, I guess I don't need to know the data specifically, but do we have a disproportionate amount of African American students designated under EBD?
Yes.
That's pretty typical of school districts.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so, what are we, and I know some of these programs do focus on the EBD from what I saw, but I'm really, really wanting to focus on like what is working with those students who are designated. And because, you know, we have a large proportion of African American students who are designated in that, what are we doing anything intentionally to focus in this area, and what program is working to help them?
Yeah, that could take the whole night. I'll try to be brief, but I mean, I think enacting our strategic framework is the absolute, like the foundation of what are we doing about it. Culturally responsive practices, and I know we've had this before. High quality teaching, you know, using assessment for appropriate instructional decision making. Those are all like base level type of how districts impact the achievement of all students. I think your question has always been more urgent than that, because that systems level change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
And so what programs I think are on a shorter cycle of you provide this intervention or this screening and then you follow through. I think what we just spoke about, Bounceback, CBITS, these interventions that we were just speaking to a moment ago actually have a high degree of mitigating the impact of or the inappropriate identification of students with disabilities. We the addition of psychologist, social worker to be able to provide tier 2 level type supports for students prior to identification also we think is going to be important. In the longer term, we're feeling that our read is that the therapeutic environment of our emerging intervention programs is having an impact. Mm-hmm. We're seeing students go through these cycles of services and then reintegrating back into their home schools, which we feel is a success. It's a constellation of many things that I feel that come to bear on addressing this.
And are we looking at, I'm assuming we're looking at the holistic environmental factors around the student, right, in their life, right, when we're...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to speak to that point, that makes me think of our intensive support team, which has as a component several of our Building Bridges teams, which focuses on working with the family, stabilizing what's going on in the home, concurrently with how do we provide and target the specific supports that a student would need. So we're stabilizing to the degree we're able to both environments. We're working with families and outside collaborating community health partners on providing physical and mental health if needed. And so it's taking a more holistic view of the student and their needs, beginning with family stabilization.
Okay. And then just one more, I guess this is going to be a request for numbers.
Okay.
I mean, I guess not only just the percentage of, but how many students are, I would be curious to know how many students are designated as EBD.
Oh, sure, I can get you that.
District. Yep.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
And disaggregated by race, or?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But I think, Gloria, I think your comments point back to the therapeutic day option as well as a major need. I mean, it reminds me of the cross-sector coalition conversations that are happening, and there are gaps, as you know, not just here in the school district, but in the community.
Exactly.
And I mean, I think we should talk about, I don't know, is there any way to accelerate our work in that area? Okay. And remember, in a week from now, we're going to be talking about these actual investments again at Operations Work Group. So we have a week to turn this around. Good to know where you're interested in
Would we be
additional
able to see the data
investments.
before that meeting?
Oh,
Stay on.
sure.
Let's move along.
Yep. Sure thing, Nikki.
So TJ's up.
Madam Kate hit most of what I wanted to hit, and especially the first questions around measuring success, and I'm glad that we're looking at longer-term outcomes. And I think that we do hear, as Kate notes, we hear expand these options for these students, expand them, and I think that we heed those voices, but there's also another little voice that says, as Gloria said and Kate said and everyone says, are we expanding something that's working? Right. And how are we defining working? And I guess that to the discussion of how we're defining working, I think John later added reintegration back into the home school, and I think that's important. I would also talk about fulfilling IEP goals and setting those goals. And so on that, on the numbers of seats we have, if you pull out Foundation Central, which is something very, very different than most of these intensive programs, we're down to about 100 seats. And if you pull out Restore, which is, kind of a very special thing, or pull out half of Restore or something, we're down to 85 seats or something like that. And like Kate, we hear the needs from the schools, and we hear about how one or two students put strains on not only the special education staffing, but the climate and beyond that. And so I guess that that's just make that point again that I think other board members have made, that what we're hearing from the schools is that there is a demand. And then I'd like to ask kind of a logistical and maybe even legal question, which is that if a CC teacher and the IEP team wrote an IEP that called for a transfer to a therapeutic environment and there were no seats in the therapeutic environment, what does that mean? What does that mean legally? What does it mean logistically? I mean, you've said that people aren't writing these into IEPs, but people aren't going to write something in the IEP if they can't get it.
Yeah, so to be in the therapeutic program does require an IEP. And I think that we do our due diligence to make sure that that's the right location, right? There's a number of program options. And there are times when people know they need something different, but we don't maybe know exactly what they need. And so there is a process of an intake process where the intensive support team, the staff at the intervention programs meet. They're like, okay, based on this profile or based on this, some of the IST members are like, I've seen this student and this is what they need. So there's a very intentional intervention matching that takes place there. And then then our administrative team will reach out to the homeschool, establish an IEP meeting. And I would say that it isn't always universally something that families are interested in. I mean, this is, we want to honor parent voice as well. And so there are times when our team might suggest, this is a great option for you, this is the option we think, this is our best option for you, and a family says, thank you, but no thanks. It's very important for me to have my child at the neighborhood school. I want just different supports there, and we work in concert. So it would not really happen that an IEP team without, that would just be writing a therapeutic day option without someone from our district office team to be a part of that. I mean, it takes authorization to make sure that it is the right fit for that student.
But if it's universally agreed it's the right fit and there's no space, what happens? I mean, that's my question. I mean, I understand that it's not always the right fit, but what happens? I mean, what happens to the district? What happens to what happens to the student? If there's if the team agrees this is the right place and there's no space.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that we have a situation just like that. We've identified that this is a particular student who should be in this program. They're on a wait list. We're making adjustments internally to make sure that we have the appropriate staffing. And there's usually like the wait list means like you're in, but we're just kind of making adjustments to get you into that program. So,
and I guess just kind of channeling Nikki, are we legally liable for leaving a student on a wait list for a program that has been agreed that they belong in? I mean, this is, I mean,
is there a time limit to someone staying on a wait list? Could it be a month, or once they're on the wait list, what steps are taken to get the child properly placed, and how long does it take?
So, yeah, I mean,
did I interrupt?
No,
a couple things.
Okay. You asked it clearer than I did.
Okay.
We don't have necessarily a hard and fast like wait list. You're in automatically after a month or anything like that. The IEP is what we're really bound to. So if the IEP says therapeutic day school, that person will be in a therapeutic day school, if that makes sense. So we don't have any circumstances though where it says the student will be in, say, primary steps, but you have to wait a month. We don't have that. We will have somebody that will be on a wait list where we are providing supports at their school, and then once that becomes available, once we make the additional adjustments that we need to, we'll reconvene the IEP and we'll make a placement decision.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Me then, Nikki.
Yeah.
But as TJ rightfully points out, the movement from an IEP designation to the development of it to the implementation of it is really essential, and as smooth as that can go is really key to this whole thing. So how that develops in here is something that we've always been concerned about, and particularly if we're decided that a placement is not just a good idea for that kid, but gets written into the IEPs. then it has to happen. That's what I'm understanding you said. If that gets in the IEP, it happens, and if that program supposedly has full, they're going to go there anyway with the proper support? Is that what I'm hearing?
They wouldn't go necessarily over capacity. Then that becomes like my responsibility to figure out where can we draw additional resources, rearrange to add the appropriate levels of staff so that we're able to actually implement the IEP. I don't want to find myself conversely where we're adding students to a program and then we're unable to implement the IEP because of a lack of staffing.
We don't
So,
wanna
we're doing
warehouse
several
for
things
sure.
at once, and we go as smoothly and as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah. Do you have a specific example of that? How something like, I know
Privacy.
what you just said is have you done that?
For sure, yeah. Like Primary Steps is brand new this year. We began with like one teacher and an SEA, and we've rearranged staff from different programs and reassigned staff to that program such that we could have now a total of 8 students in that program. So we very quickly noted that students may not be positively responding to LEAP placements, but Primary Steps has been the program location and type where they're thriving in a really obvious manner.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Nick, go ahead.
My question is both for Matt and for John. Matt, can you come up here as well quickly? I'm sorry to drag you up. Just want to ask a couple questions, if that's okay, and I mean all due respect. But my question is as follows. If we legally cannot provide for the IEP, they can send their child to a private school and we have to pay for it, correct, under IDEA law?
There's quite a few procedural steps that apply there in terms of notice. But if there was a ruling by a hearing officer that we did not provide FAPE and the parent chose to enroll their child in a private school, a possibility is that we would be required to either reimburse or pay for that placement, yes.
So if we legally could not fit someone, it was universally decided that it was appropriate, and we legally could not find a way to fit them in, then we could send them elsewhere but would have to pay for it.
Well, the parent could place them there through a parentally placed private school student, or the district could place a student in a private school as well. That's unusual in Madison, in my experience, because we do have a variety of alternative placements. But I think what your question is if we put a placement down in the IEP, we have to implement that placement. That's absolutely
There's no doubt
true.
about that. And you guys remember, because we're a larger district and because of our investment in this area, we have many more options available than almost anyone around us.
Correct.
I mean, I just need to emphasize that. The surrounding districts, they are paying private institutions for therapeutic day settings because they cannot provide them inside of their school district. So yes, we always need to figure out how to push and add more seats, but we have so much more available than most places, and I think...
I remember on items several months ago that we paid for therapeutic day treatment to Lad Lake.
Yeah, it certainly happens. Yeah.
Last call, special ed stuff. Well, move down into innovative alternatives, and I think it's important now that these three are all together because there's overlaps and links in all of these, and we have to look at it from that perspective. Each department area is different in their own issues they have to deal with, but we're really dealing with kids that aren't making it in regular mainstream, and what can we do to make sure that they have an educational option that goes forward. So, Paraschool, you're up. Have at it.
Cool. So last year, Ricardo, in the collaboration with a lot of other people, started looking at our readiness and recuperation options for our district as it pertains to opportunity youth. Thinking about readiness in terms of having the potential to identify students who may need different innovative setting to meet their needs. Currently, and then recuperation being you have obviously demonstrated based on lack of success in some particular area or related to credits, et cetera, that you need a different option, and those being our recuperation options. This slide, looking at where we are now, gives a little quick snapshot of our current state. And as you can see here, our readiness options essentially being the two, Shabazz and Capital, recuperation, the 4 you have listed there. And most are operating, as you can see, at capacity and thinking about 6 or 7 or so students at Capital, and then 84% with about 26, 27 students at Shabazz. Thinking about where we currently are with that piece, and then looking at our students who are currently off track, I want to make sure I talk about particularly that number there, that 500, which comes from our early warning system in our high schools, our 4 comprehensive high schools, where to be part of 500, you need to be meeting 3 of the 5 areas, looking at credit attainment, GPA, 2 or more Fs, suspensions, and or attendance. So again, I also want to know that 500 is not saying that there are 500 students plus in our high school, our comprehensive high schools now, that actually need something else. Again, that 500 is saying that these students, based on those factors, are showing that they are off track in some way. And actually, I would say that 500 is 20%, if not less than that. So you're looking at 80 to 100 students.
To take this, they had a specific number in there, and I didn't want us to think that there were 546 kids only, and it's a floating number. It can go up and down at different times, and as you can see, just Shabazz alone is only running at 84%. So there's slots available. There's a number in there that's a moving target.
And off track doesn't mean you need an alternative setting.
Yes, and again, like I said before, that's the point. 3 to 5. I mean, again, our early warning system, right? You also have yellow, right, where students are not meeting 3 of those pieces as well. But as we talk about our students who are off track, the most right now, 3 to 5 areas that'd be that approximate number we have there. And again, reiterate, not all students need that alternative setting away from our comprehensive high schools.
Just to get you to say this again, Paris, but what subset of that do you think might?
I would say 20% or less. So about 80 to 100 may need like.
So that might be the number we want to focus in on.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw the 500 had a jump out.
Yeah.
And again, the 500 really being there just to let us know, right? We have students in our comprehensive schools who are, based on our system that we are using, the early warning system, in 3 or more areas are off track in some way. So thinking about where are we going, number one, thinking about our current readiness and recuperation pieces, making sure we are maximizing our current alternative seats. Some people may actually say like, oh, Capital has 6 or 7. We needed like those kids in there right now. One thing that we also are making sure we are doing is ensuring that we are keep being aware that you can't just enroll students at any given time, any point in the semester, and thinking about what students need and talking to students who have been in alternatives in and out. That transition piece is key. And then also there are some pieces where students may be enrolled and leave, so the number may be up and down as well. But there are plans thinking about especially the 19-20 school year, thinking about a place that has 27 potential seats open like a Shabazz. What is our plans for implementation to make sure we are getting the right students in those spaces and make sure their needs are being met?
Okay, sure, go ahead, Nikki.
Question, I know Shabazz for a while had different admission requirements. I know that was an issue on attendance for a lot of students. Is there talks about changing that?
Alex, you want to speak to it?
There are, and Alex would be best equipped to talk about that.
Sorry
Would you mind
to drag
coming up
everyone
that?
up here. Not trying. Really not trying for musical chairs.
Good evening, everyone. So a couple years ago, there was work done on the specific attendance policies with Shabazz. And as it relates to the entrance criteria, that's currently being looked at right now for Shabazz to ensure that we're not creating any barriers for students to enter.
Okay.
Just
Thank you.
While you're here, Alex, is it just the entrance attendance, or is there other aspects of the entrance requirements that are being looked at?
I think it's the whole thing.
That was my impression. Yeah. I just wanted to check
including
that.
the exit criteria as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the reading at grade level 1 also,
all
which is
that.
ill-defined,
Yep.
and yeah.
Yep.
Fine.
Yep.
All good. All good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
No problem.
Appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt, Paris.
Oh no, that's fine. You're fine. Lastly, just mentioning that as we think about maximizing current seats and looking at a place like Capitol, who we have these conversations all the time about increasing seats. Thinking about the operation of the work group and conversations around, they're pretty much running at capacity. So if we are seeing the results and kids and the need for people wanting that type of space for the alternative setting, thinking about, what our actual physical locale needs that we have to make sure there's even a possibility to increase seats there with a 2 sites already basically running at capacity right now. Moving forward to the micro schools, wanted to make sure each comprehensive high school is provided with a 1-year intensive support runway for students to recuperate and transition. Looking at a year-to-year rollout, we talked about it many times. The office still stands, strong on the piece that we don't want these micro schools to be sites where individuals just say, student need a seat, they out of our schools, and there is no actual ramp potentially later on down the road for students to be able to enter back into home schools. So I definitely want to make sure we reiterate that piece. And then thinking about the 1 year, how are we working on the cognitive work, the identity work, the social emotional work, and also credit recovery as we're trying to get students back on track and back in the place where they actually can perform well, whether it be after that 1 year going back to their home school or entering into an essential alternative innovative space after that. Regardless what it is, we know students have needs. We want to make sure our micro schools are working on the particular areas to meet those specific needs. And again, I know it was mentioned before about, well, what happens if a student after this 1 year is not ready to go back into any potential space. And at that point, we're obviously working with the staff in that space, making sure that we have graduation plans or reentry plans for students to potentially enter back and or stay at the micro school, depending on if that is a need that's decided by not just staff, but working with the families and the students as well to give them what's best for them as well as deserved. And then lastly, talking about our community partnerships, we're seeing just a need to, over the next couple of years, we want to create a re-engagement center in collaboration with key stakeholders in the community. Thinking about if I'm a family and my student is off track, we don't know where to go, we don't know who to see, we're not getting answers somewhere, having a central located site that is, like I said, in collaboration not just with the district but community stakeholders as well, so that families as well as youth know I can, if I'm trying to get back into school and get re-engaged, I can go to this particular space and I'll be able to get my needs met. Not saying that space, like the micro school space, should not be like the re-engagement center space, right? Like an actual space where I may be a student that dropped out of school at 16, I'm now 18, I say I want to now get back into some program or some option, they can go to the re-engagement center and get their needs met there as well.
TJ. I like the recuperate and transition language, and I look forward to hearing more about that, and also whether the micro school is going to be on-site, off-site, and particularly, and I'm guessing we're going to hear more about this probably at the operations work group, and maybe I'm wrong, but also the student selection criteria is something I'm very interested in. But my question has nothing to do with that, which is, I sat at this table for almost 6 years now, and I don't think we've ever defined or discussed night school. And if anyone here can share student selection, the goals of the program, how many students are enrolled, what's going on, because I think that certainly that's part of the context that we're talking about tonight, and it's not on the list again tonight of things we're talking about. So Alex is nodding his head. Maybe you can help. Is it part of Capitol High? Is it part of East and West? There's so much I don't know.
It might be more advantageous for us to include that in our conversation next week, but just know that
that's fine. It just, so let's put it on the list, because it's just something that, just a rough idea how many students.
It ranges from 75 to 125.
It's bigger than a lot of the programs we've talked about tonight. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. That's
all right. Nikki.
Just one quick comment. Can we please avoid putting a micro school in a place of worship or run by a place of worship?
Wait, I didn't think he
Place
talked.
of worship.
I didn't hear it.
Can we please avoid putting the micro school in a place of worship? Or run by a place of worship, please?
Not run. Gloria.
So just have a question on the Youth Re-Engagement Center. I know that the National League of Cities has done a lot of work around this, and I'm just wondering through your research how this has been funded. Like, how does a re-engagement center get funded in other cities? Do you know what?
I mean, so in turn, if it's going to be a true collaborative, right, you figure out who's going to provide what services to the space, and then their particular entities will be contributing that piece. In terms of thinking about our district piece, we feel we obviously want to have staff in there as it relates to, you know, support workers and whether it be social work, pieces like that. So when the students are coming in, it may be some barriers to break down to get to like why they actually left the system in the first place, and then what may be the best option for them to get back. So essentially, this all depends on, you know, if it's going to be district led, then it's going to be the district is going to fund it. But again, thinking about best practice for a city of this magnitude, and also as was mentioned earlier, there are numerous different factors that play a role throughout our city and why students are disengaged. Wanted to make sure we utilize our partnerships and everybody at the table to be part of creating such a center like this.
Yeah, this would be great for the cross-sector coalition to take up.
Yeah, I would just be curious on like what it looks like in other cities and counties.
Yeah.
And what that model looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, you can bring some examples to the table. Yep.
Kate?
Can you talk a little bit about, like, how are you thinking about alternatives, right? Because we're talking about a group of kids really from 6th grade probably that for whom traditional school isn't resonating. That's kind of, and you're smiling, which means it's probably not the same definition that you're using. But I just, when I think about alternatives, there's a whole additional set of things that could be in there that are, you know, an arts school, a performing arts school, right? Like I mean, there's more positive ways, I guess, to spin the idea of alternatives that are more interesting, more relevant.
Yes, ma'am.
More differentiated, more focused, and I mean, we keep going back to this micro schools idea. Have we thought about others? What's your thought on that, I guess?
So thinking about immediate need, right? Like the micro school conversation provides a direct support for a handful, 25 or so students, right? So you're thinking about I'm studying here in this conversation just like you are about we have this handful of students in our high schools that for whatever reason need a different space. That's one path of, again, recuperation of, okay, where are we currently at now? Who is it not working for, and let's provide something for them. And then typically that lands in the realm, oftentimes, obviously, like in the graduation realm, like they need to graduate, they need credits, where, you know, thinking about our office and our existence in this district, of how do we begin to get to that place of having these proactive conversations related to, as a 6th grader, I know I want to go into arts. So there's a space and a path for me to get to that way that may not be part of our comprehensive high school model. That's also definitely part of when you say like visioning for like our office and where we want to go, definitely.
When do we get to hear about that stuff?
Again, thinking about immediate needs and like the system piece at the same time, like I want to make sure folks hear me publicly say, right, there's, I don't know, probably 10 people that probably understand the sense of urgency that is present here for us. But one thing that has been clear to many of the stakeholders I talk to, including families and students, is that parents don't want us to just create something to put kids at if they're not sure that we have not just a hope that it'll be successful, but spent that time planning for and making sure it's built based upon students with their input to make it happen. And that's essentially why it takes longer to like put these things in place. But essentially I'm also hearing the same sentiments in the building. So as you say, you see micro schools a lot. That's just looking at like one of our best practice models after what we learned last year that can really have an impact. I don't want to say fast, but I would say faster than it would take to literally get off the ground performing arts school.
I'm excited to have both conversations are important. I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's so much, we're big-ish community, right? We have a lot of opportunity to bring some of those other things.
And you know, even school within the school models, right? We said 500, right? And now all those models need to be outside of school. Like, where is the room for us to get creative and just even what a school day looks like? Yep. For students, right? Where it may be a 7-to-7 model in the school, and you know, principals are staggered, and students can, you know, you can do a lot of different things within the actual current structure of a comprehensive school. That may not just be the typical 8 to 4.
There's the one piece I have just sitting in the corner of my page, which I don't really know where it fits in, so I'm going to throw it out now. But it's early childhood, and if you think about alternatives, one model that lots of cities have looked at is, you know, some combined early childhood daycare. We talked about a health clinic earlier, right? Like, there's something there, and again, we need the idea to galvanize around. It aligns with some of our facilities discussions that we had a couple weeks ago. And
my cousin in Illinois had one in which the students in high school were interested in going into education. They had an outside daycare, and what they did was they had them teach the students for credit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And just lastly, again, right, not saying like that's a super amazing, nice idea, but making sure our strategy is driven by like our needs and our students around here in this space, right? I don't want to start, let's have like a, and I'm not saying you're saying that.
I'm not at all, and I'm very much, I mean, the question is what's interesting and relevant and that our kids and families want to opt into, and then how do we build that? I just don't want to wait so long to ask the question to get there, you know. So
I agree.
And we've got to pay attention to emerging opportunities, right? There's a new youth arts center that's going to be breaking ground. Well, it already is. It's going to open in the fall, right? Like, and that won't be used during the day and during the week very much, right? Like, there's the work we know we need to do with urgency and the opportunities that exist in our community and partnership, and how do we grab onto those?
So one thing we're finding, right, again, bumping up against the confines of like quote unquote traditional and people being okay and wanting to explore different, like even conversations that we're having with MATC around most programs right now start at 17. Like, is it a way to like collaborate to bump that essentially back? I don't want a student who comes in as a freshman saying, I know culinary is my track, that's what I want to do, cosmetology, but now I have to like essentially go through the motions to get to that place versus how can we be more proactive in doing some more innovative, creative things like that too.
Yep. Okay, let's move on.
So, I mean, I think just to close, I mean, I'm not trying to close this out, but just in reviewing, we've had some discussions about this during our staff board retreat. And as we are looking at the behavior education plan, these intensive supports, I really want us to talk about how we can support our teachers and our staff through this as well. And so now to add something else to this, right? We are talking about our students who really need a lot of intensive support, but I really want us to, in that same conversation, is talk about how do we support our teachers and our staff. And so I don't know if we do this time or what, but I really just wanted to state that because I think it's important. I think we can't support our students if we're not looking at the health and wellness of our teachers and our staff who are dealing with such complex issues day in and day out. I visited a few schools on Friday, and we have some excellent staff and teachers who are doing some good work under some stressful situations. And I just want us to explore that as we are looking to our next steps. So just wanted to say that.
Okay, Mary?
Just back to the proposal. So the funding that's in this, and maybe that's the next slide. Yep, it's the next slide, is $320,000. The part that is about the innovative alternatives that I see is $320,000 for the micro school expansion. So is that set to open with the start of the 1920 school year?
Essentially, that would be the plan, you know, which is contingent on like the funding and the hiring of the qualified staff.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I'm going to back you up to the, not the budget slide, but the one on top, and there's two areas that I'm concerned with. First of all, I think sometimes we get stuck in a mindset that someone going into an innovative alternative has to be a certain kind of profile. And I don't look at it like that. And as you already heard a couple other board members saying, we really need to view this more as an option, not a profile of kid that's not making it, going to go to a different program designed for you. There are options available. Similarly, like our two charters, our magnet school, there are options that we can provide for students that they would prefer. I know I would have preferred a model like Capitol High when I was in high school. I just kind of skated through high school, got my work done, turned it in, and left high school going, I don't know, I just don't want to get drafted. So there were things that I would have liked to have had pointed out to me and exposed to me as an option that might have worked better for me. But I was not a profile of a kid that was not being successful like was. So I think we get stuck too often in alternatives being only for the kids that aren't making it. And we got to do something special for you, as opposed to, and when I don't look at it that way, I agree with Kate that an option should potentially be a school of the arts. STEM doesn't just have to be over at Madison College on Park Street. We can have that at Capitol High too. So there are options we can create for kids that might want to opt in to that type of program. So we know about micro schools from last year. We got a lot of information out of that, so it's time to scale up, and probably a year too late. I don't know what some of our schools are doing now. Apparently we got some things going on right now, I'm not certain. And the community partnerships as well, I think we have opportunities there to expand that with being more creative in how we work with some of them, specifically Fresh Start. I think there's an opportunity that there are a lot of students that would prefer that model. And why wait till you're 17 or can only get into AmeriCorps and that kind of stuff? We might be able to expand our opportunity to create our own program with them. And so our community partnerships, using just that one as an example, we can partner with other ones too that aren't even in existence right now. So that's what I would see. Just don't get into the mindset that this is for the kids that are failing in regular school and this is the only thing that's going to save them. It's not that. It's just an option that we can provide for more kids, leading towards a future that they can be engaged in. That's where I think we need to really start thinking on this thing. So any more questions about the programming, or you want to get into this budget thing? Because now this covers all of them, and it's for 2 years, next year and the following year, which some of us won't be here for. So we got to make it clear to the new people coming on, and you get to get your marching orders about this. So, Kate, anything on the other ones, or you want to go forward?
I mean, maybe just for next week, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. I guess I'd love to see something in here just a little bit more clear around our secondary approach. Well, much of this is still very focused on elementary, barring the micro school expansion. So just have a think on, and if that's truly not our next X dollars spent, then that's okay. But it feels like we could be accelerating there if we had the funds. So that would be probably the clearest ask for next week. On what look, it's your I think it's four of you up here to articulate what the best way to do that is. But we have half of our district in secondary, how do we try to push a little harder there to support kids.
Got it.
Go.
Yeah, and just while we're kind of asking for things for when we go to operations for these things, on the BEP professional development, I'd like to kind of have an accounting of our current expenditures in that what we're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is this $200,000? Does that double what we're spending? Is it all brand new? I mean, I just don't have a sense of what is training and support for schools and developing foundational practices. So I'd like to know what's in place now, and what it costs.
Yep.
Nikki?
And my one ask is the list of pilots and how much we're paying this year on the pilots.
Well, let's get to this, the budget, the project investments here. Just to be clear, this is the 1920 is what they're recommending, and then additional on top of the 1920 is 2021. So behavioral health will be in 2021 180. So that it's essentially doubled some of the stuff. So this is what numbers come down to. Now, maybe one thing you can do is this new dollars, or is this reallocation of some staff being switched over to something else?
That's a good question. We're going to go into that in detail next week at the operations work group. But what we committed to was $1 million in reallocation within the central office budget. So we'll go into those details next week.
Any other thoughts on this slide then?
Yeah, and then the last slide just basically reiterates what we talked about, going into the mental health expansion a little bit more at the secondary level, and then also delving a bit into facilities and how that might also impact our plans for expansion moving into the years to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've already mentioned to you the table here about my thoughts on facilities expansion. We've got land we could build on. We've got potential purchases, and maybe we can get this city to give us that medical facility that they just got on John Nolan Drive there. So anyway, there's opportunities there that we could provide. Instead of renting facilities, own them and get some cost savings and get some cool buildings up too. So we got mental health expansion, special ed, continuing ongoing review of that guy, and our innovative alternatives really being looked at, hopefully with the idea of expanding options for all, and they all interlink. These all interlink, so I'm glad we put them all together so that we can start looking at it that way.
I got one more thing.
Kate?
Sorry, I have one, maybe two things. Just we talked a lot about family engagement during the ad hoc and the way in which that kind of supports a holistic view into both academics and behavior. I don't see anything on paper about increasing family engagement, and so just again, maybe a request for next week, if there's a way to use money or time, which is money, to increase our engagement with families. I guess I'd love to see again what your recommendation would be for that. I know we've done things previously in transition years with home visits, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if Michelle has ideas. I'm sure she does. But just something in there. We talked a lot about it. It was clearly one of the kind of practices that we had found that was successful. And so is there a way to amplify and increase the way that we're interacting with families from a budget perspective? Would be the other question.
Okay, a couple other things. We used to have programs here that address some of these things. There used to be a program called SOAR, which was for single mothers, and they would bring their children and would have daycare services there. School within a school program, one of their job sites were daycare centers where some of their children would be at, and then in the afternoon they'd be working in a daycare center. So there's a lot of options that aren't new, and it's important, I think, that we really seriously understand that we are an urban school district. And a lot of people will say, oh yeah, right, we're a city, we're urban, but there's different, when you say an urban school district, that means different things in this context. And the type of programming and options that we're beginning to think about need to happen in an urban school district, because that's what we are here. We have big city urban problems in our city, and they leak into our school. There's no way that they won't, and we have to respond in the ways that we can and collaborate with partners in city and county government as well. So I think we're on our way there, but we have to look at it from a big picture, and then also what we can do in our schools with our kids that are having issues or even not having issues, just want a different choice. So all that comes together. Anybody else want to make any parting little comments? Are we good? Yeah. All right, I guess we're adjourned. All in favor? Imad? Someone second this too? Kate seconded. And
I have more.
we all voted for it.